Good evening, attendees. Professor Đặng Văn Chí, Assistant Professor Doãn Đào, and our dearest attendees and guests. It's now 7 p.m. on tonight, and we are about to start our webinar tonight. And for the house rule, I will have a thorough presenting for the best presentation tonight, and we are assuring that all of the live event will be recorded, and all of our guests will have a link to the final content when the webinar is finished. And do not hesitate to give us questions by answering the Google Forms. We have details in the description of this video. We also have a live transmission to YouTube for those who cannot attend tonight's presentation on Microsoft Teams. And the program itinerary will be the opening remarks from distinguished guests in the first 10 minutes. And then it is our main presentation from Professor Đặng Văn Chí in 35 minutes. And then we'll have a 5-minute break. And then from 7:45, we will have a question and answer and discussion time in about 40 minutes. And finally, we have a program summary and closing remarks in 10 minutes. Due to some local traffic constraint, our Vice Rector in charge, Associate Professor Nguyễn Thanh Hiệp, may be a little bit late, and may I ask for your patience that he will come in a little bit later. And meanwhile, you are all recommend to have yourself in a convenient place and enjoy with us the presentation for the program, for the writing and presenting the webinar tonight. Sorry. My name is, I'm sorry from beginning, I should introduce myself. My name is Ngoc Nguyễn, and I am the correspondent officer of the research unit from the Pham Thach University of Medicine. And we are now moving our screen to all of our distinguished guests and presenter tonight. So first is our Professor Đặng Văn Chí. Can the Professor Đặng Văn Chí is scientific director of Ludwig Institute for Cancer Research, and he is also the professor of the Wistar Institute and editor-in-chief of the prestigious Cancer Research Journal. He has more than 40 years of experience in cancer research, and it is our privilege and our utmost honor to have him tonight with us. So, can Professor Đặng Văn Chí, you have something to speak with our attendees, please? I will have you leading the presentation from now.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Min. Xin chào quý vị. I will speak English from here on. I thank you very much for the invitation to present to you. As it's stated here, writing and presenting medical data for scientific publication. Next slide. So just a little bit of background. The way I'm going to provide you with some information about publication is from a perspective of somebody who has written quite a few papers as an author, as a faculty member, as a journal referee, and as well as an editor of a key cancer journal. And so from my perspective, publication is really a way of communicating discoveries in biomedical science and also to advance biomedicine for the sake of taking care of patients. So just a little bit of background myself, I've published over 300 publications, and it's not only a way of communicating our research findings, but it's also in academic medicine, we publish to be able to get research grants, for example, from the National Cancer Institute to continue to do research. So publication itself is really a means to get research grants. And then publication also is a way to achieve academic advancement. So one starts at an assistant professor in academic medicine. Publication counts quite a bit for advancement to associate and full professor. I've served as professor at Johns Hopkins as well as the University of Pennsylvania before I moved to the Wistar Institute, and also to join the Ludwig Institute for Cancer Research. And I'm also going to give you the perspective of publication from the editor perspective. And here I perceive my role as editor as contributing to the public good, to be able to look at publications to make sure they are credible and meritorious for publication. Next slide. So cancer research has been continuously published since 1941. It has an impact factor of 9.7, about to achieve over 10. It's the most frequently cited oncology journal in the world in 2019. As editor-in-chief, I assure rapid decision times from the time of submission of the publication to the publication itself. And also we can transfer publication between various AACR journals, the American Association for Cancer Research. And this journal receives well over 3,000 manuscript submissions every year. And we publish only about 10% of that. And in order to do that, it's required many people that's shown here in photographs without their names. They serve as senior editors for the journal, allowing for the journal to really control quality of what it publishes. Next slide. So this is just an example of one journal of many journals you can find out there. You can find purely clinical journals, purely basic science journals, for example. Here I just use Cancer Research as an example because it provides for all types of papers, all the way from case reports to clinical trials, basic science, also to population science, as well as reviews, commentaries, and perspectives and highlights. And so this journal is quite broad, and that's why I can give you relatively good perspective of the type of publications that you can prepare to submit to various journals. Next slide. So in publishing a biomedical paper, the best guide to writing a good paper is make sure you ask an important question. ask the best question you can come up with to answer a critical gap in knowledge. There's something that's not known, and you want to find out how to answer that question, whether it's through clinical research to look for a better therapy, whether it's basic science research to look for new discoveries of new mechanisms that leads to new drugs, or just to look at ways that the practice of medicine can be changed purely by implementation science. And so, at least from the scientific perspective, form a hypothesis or a model or a question that you want to ask. And it is the research part that you allow for you to collect the evidence for or against the concept. And then, of course, if the evidence support the concept, you want to replicate the data. This is critically important, to reproduce your data and put it together into a narrative that is a story that brings together the evidence to tell the story of what the model is. And this is kind of the general perspective of how to write a biomedical paper. Next slide. So I just want to give you a glimpse of the anatomy of a biomedical paper. All papers will have something like the following. First, you have the title page. You also have a running title that goes printed on every page of your article in a journal that tells each page on what that paper is about. Authorship, which I'll talk a little bit about, who should be included in authorship. The abstract is a succinct statement of the findings, the problem, the evidence, and how it supports to answer your question. And then the introduction should be a succinct review of the field to give a background as well as the rationale for your study. That is the reason why you're asking the question you're asking. And then the results section, you provide the body of evidence that you've collected, the data, the analysis of the data. And then in the discussion section, you provide interpretation of the evidence. And also in the interpretation, you should also be mindful to provide your view of the pitfalls. That is, no body of evidence is going to be perfect, and you need to point out where the imperfections are and to be circumspect about the conclusions that you're drawing in a discussion. And then the method section has to be thoroughly presented to give all the details on how to replicate the study. This is extremely important in the literature, that other people can replicate your study for reproducibility. So if you report something, it better be generalizable and reproducible. And then there's a section that's critically important now that state the conflict of interest of authors. That is, do you have any potential source of bias, whether that's because you're paid by a company or you have some sort of a conflict of interest because of the subject matter that you want to tell the world about. So this is critically important to disclose, particularly if you have commercial interests in the paper that you're writing. For example, if a company provides you with money to do a clinical study, this should be disclosed in a conflict of interest. So when people read the paper, they know that there's a potential conflict to be able to interpret your paper in that context. And then finally, you can provide acknowledgements of funding sources, people who've helped with the project, to acknowledge them for the contribution. Next slide. So let me just run very quickly. I use one of our paper that was published in 2017 as an example of a paper. In this particular paper, we published a paper where we've taken pancreatic cancer samples from patients, and then we inoculate animals, mice, with this. And then what we did was to treat the mice with various drugs that hits metabolism. And we reported the efficacy of the diabetic drug, fenformin, to inhibit the growth of pancreatic cancer. And this was performed largely at Johns Hopkins when I was a faculty there before I moved to the University of Pennsylvania. So the title here, you can see is illustrated in this journal, Clinical Cancer Research. And then you see a list of authors. And on every page of this paper, you'll see a running title, which is called Efficacy of Fenformin in Pancreatic Cancer PDXs, shown at the bottom right. So this is the structure of the paper with a title and running title. If you go to the next slide. Now this slide is critically important. So you can see the list of authorships, of authors in this authorship statement here. So at least in biomedical science, the contribution of the authors are recognized and then also stated at the end of the paper what the contributions are. The convention usually is the first author. In this case, is N.V. Rakesh Kumar is the person who did the most work for the experiments. The last author is the lead author, the lead corresponding author, the principal investigator, if you will. That was me, that designed and drive the project. So you'll see that most journals now ask for you to articulate the contributions of each author. So for example, conception and design, development of methods have to be spelled out. Who actually developed the methods? Who did the experiments and acquired the data? And you need to really state that out. Who participated in the analysis of data and interpretation of the data? So many people are involved in this. And then those who write the paper, review it, and revise the manuscripts are listed. You also show administrative, technical, and material support. Then finally, who supervised the study. So this is how authorship is constructed, that you have to justify every author on what their contributions are. So authors should not be put on if they don't provide some contribution that's tangible to the paper. And this is critically important for many journals nowadays if you try to publish. And then if you go to the next slide. So the order of authorship is quite important in biomedicine. This is in contrast to physics, where in physics, usually very large group that does physical sciences and publish in physics journals, the authors are presented in alphabetical order according to the last name, the family name. However, in biomedical science, the first author, as I alluded to, is the main executive, the person who executes the study. The last author is the head of the study, the principal investigators. Usually the order of importance is that the second author provides the next contribution, third, fourth, and so on. And then the more senior authors, the principal investigator of the various laboratories, are next to the last authors. This is the convention that is used in many different journals. And so one of the advice I have when you start out doing a study is to discuss with your collaborators. Generally now when you publish a paper, there are many people involved, different teams are involved. It's always important to determine order of authorships as you start the study with your collaborators before you draft the manuscripts when the study is done. So there's no misunderstanding when the paper is submitted, so people aren't upset that they are not listed in the right order. So this is critically important. And then if you go to the next slide, and the abstract, as I already stated, you don't have to look at the details here, but the abstract is from the same paper that I showed you. It's very long. It has a lot of details on it, but it should be a succinct statement of the problem, the data, and the findings. And this is in contrast to this landmark paper by Watson and Crick on the structure of DNA. And this is a short paper in Nature in 1953. And you can see that the abstract, if you will, the first statement, it states, so the title is very simple: molecular structure of nucleic acid, a structure for deoxyribose nucleic acid. And then their abstract, if you will, said, we wish to suggest a structure for the salt of deoxyribose nucleic acid, DNA. This structure has novel features that are of considerable biological interest. So very succinct, and this is landmark that has changed the world. Next slide. So now I go into the introduction again, just to repeat, it should provide sufficient background, literature review. So you really look at the literature, review it very succinctly to say, this is what we know about the state of the art of the field. And then you state what the gap of knowledge is. What is not known? What are the questions you're trying to answer, the rationale for your paper, and then state the novelty of your finding, the key findings of your paper, so that when people go into the next section, which is the results on the next slide, you can present your data in various forms, whether it's in tables. This is again from the paper that I used as an example, our paper, where we provide a table here, where we actually studied many different patient-derived xenografts, over a dozen or so. These are the mutations, a genetic mutation, whether it's a P53 mutation, KRAS, SMAD4, P10. So if you go to the next slide, we can also present data in form of figures. In this case, we illustrate that when we treat these tumors in the mice with either fenformin or metformin, which is a diabetic drug, this is the decrease in tumor growth of a various tumor from different patients shown at the bottom. So here you see about a dozen patients samples that were treated in mice. And then on the right, you can see in panel B, represents the growth of the tumor. Control meaning it's not treated. Now you can see treated with fenformin, which slowed the tumor down. And then if you look at fenformin in the green line, it slows it down the most. So this just provides evidence that fenformin as a single agent in mice treating patient samples, that we can decrease tumor growth. So if you go to the next slide. And then in a discussion, we provide an interpretation of the evidence and the pitfalls. And so I would advise you to be conservative, but you can speculate. Based on the data, you can try to conclude on the data that you have. So from the data that I provide very succinctly for you from our paper, we can conclude that fenformin does have an effect on human tumors that is implanted into mice. And it may have an effect in the clinic if we do a clinical trial, although we don't know that the mouse system is going to reflect in humans. So we can speculate, however, that it may work, but that's pending on clinical trials. So you also don't want to be overreaching, try to overreach with the conclusion to go beyond the evidence, and try to be scholarly, to be more circumspect on limiting to what the evidence you really have. Next slide. And then I want to touch a little bit on reproducibility, which is really important, whether you're doing a clinical trial, which is very difficult to reproduce right away, but in basic science, you actually can reproduce laboratory findings such as studies in the mice. So this is critically important because publications should be reproducible, so the body of knowledge that we generate is reliable, so that it's truly something you can believe in. So it has to be reproducible. Next slide. And the reason why reproducibility is so important is it is central to the progress of science. It is also maintain public trust, because if we publish things that can't be reproduced, the public cannot no longer trust the scientific enterprise. So the way to do this, you design good experiments, you have very strong controls for your experiments, you have to have sufficient sample size and statistical power, avoid bias, that is selection bias of your data, and something called p-hacking, which is you do the experiments enough time just to get statistical significance is not correct. You have to do power calculation ahead of time with a statistician, and then you do the study and then replicate it to see if it holds up or not. And then, like I said, when you talk about your data, try to have nuanced narrative. Don't oversimplify the narrative. Then finally, I just want to quote Einstein, who said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And that's a really important guideline when you're trying to present data that's reproducible. Next slide. So I already alluded to the fact that conflict of interest is critically important. This is where you disclose potential source of bias. So in the case of the paper that I showed you, there were no declaration of interest. This is actually an acknowledgement of interest, conflict of interest, in a different paper that I had published with a group of investigators, where we report a potential drug that hits lactate dehydrogenase and it has an effect on cancer, but we have a patent file for this technology. So we disclose in that paper that we are inventors of a patent related to this work, and that's important because when people read the paper, they have to be mindful that maybe there's some biases in the paper, whether it's conscious or unconscious, that you have to be aware that there may be some conflict of interest that sways the interpretation of the data. Then finally, acknowledgements is always important to acknowledge the funding source, whether it's governmental source, philanthropic, and also to acknowledge other people who have helped out with the studies, whether you get reagents from other people or other scientists who have read the paper to help criticize the paper before it's submitted. Next slide. So in constructing a manuscript, here's some rule of thumb, some guidelines. Review the initial hypothesis. What is your hypothesis? What is your question? Review the collective evidence. And then if the evidence don't quite fit with your initial question, revise the hypothesis. That is, if the hypothesis wasn't quite exactly right, you look at the evidence and then you alter the hypothesis to fit with the evidence. And then you propose a revised hypothesis. That should be the narrative for the manuscript. And then in preparing your manuscript, the way that I would advise you to do it is first to outline parts of the results section. You know what the data are. You sit down and you provide an outline of the results section. Think about how you're going to tell the story and put down the flow of evidence to support that narrative, to support your hypothesis, and then emphasize on replication and reproducibility. Indicate this is the evidence that I have gathered, and I've replicated this several times, right? You triplicate, duplicate whatever number of replications. And then also the other advice too is, as you're doing a study, you may be collecting evidence at different times that fits into the story that's not sequential, right? Because you can be doing experiments where new information comes in that change the story. And as you tell the story, the evidence that you collect over time does not have to be told according to the time that you collect the evidence. It's just how it fits into the story, not the time that you collected it. So you can write your story any way you want, as long as you have the body of evidence independent when you collect it to fit into the narrative. And that's really important to design a well-constructed narrative that gives a storyline that's easy to follow, easy to read, and you understand the evidence behind the question that you're trying to answer. Next slide. And then in preparing a manuscript, you also should construct provisional tables. What is the body of evidence you want to show? Tables to construct provisional figures that accompanies the outline of what you're going to write in the results section. So I always start out by taking all the body of evidence we have, and then I begin to sort of outline the paper, and then you put together the figures as figure one. What are you trying to say with figure one? That's your narrative. What's the body of evidence there? What is it trying to show? And then you try to prepare figure two with all the evidence in there. And then you also connect it with a narrative on what you're trying to say in figure two. And you also try to prepare ahead of time figure legends. that is the narrative that describes the figures itself is called a figure legend. And then what you have is you have a draft of your paper sections, a draft of all the figures, that is one by one figure, the draft of the figure legends, and you begin to connect what you write in the narrative to the figures. And then you can always sit back after you put together the entire draft, and you can rearrange the figures if you have to tell the story in a way that is easy to read, easy to follow. That's okay, as long as the evidence you show in the figures remain what they are and they are replicated. And then basically, essentially, a paper is like an argument. You have a question, you have the data, you're trying to tell the reader that you've answered this question, and here's your body of evidence, and you're trying to convince your reader that you have answered this question, or you've tested the hypothesis and you've proven it. So in your discussion, this is your conclusion section. This is where you bring it all together. You succinctly restate what is not known in the field. What is the gap of knowledge? And that's why you're trying to ask this question to fill that gap. And so basically you restate what is not known, you summarize your findings, how you fill the knowledge gap, but then in interpreting your data and concluding from the data, be conservative, don't overreach, don't overinterpret your data, and then also mention caveats, exceptions, things that we don't really know at the moment, things that we still need to know. What are the current limitations of the study? What are the remaining gaps that needs to be filled? This is important for the advancement of science because we always are filling gaps. More gaps are being filled every day. Our knowledge is getting better and better every day, but we're just reaching that perfection and never really perfected. So next slide, please. So let me take you through peer review. So now you prepare your manuscript, you polish it, you write it, you rewrite it, you rewrite it again, and you finally get a final draft. And what I advise you to do is once you have a final draft with all your figures, everything's connected, make sure you check it many times for any kind of errors, particularly typographical errors. Make sure all the references are done correctly. Make sure you reference the key papers in your field. Do not leave them out. And then I also advise that you send it to a few friends who can read the paper for you and provide you with advice to say, the paper's reading okay, but it has some problems. You may want to look at fixing this and that. So always try to get some people to read your manuscript before you submit it to the journal. So let me just take you through how the journal, from the side of the journal, how the journal handle manuscripts. So like I said before, as editor-in-chief of Cancer Research, we receive over 3,500 manuscripts a year. So that's a little bit over 10 manuscripts every working day. And we publish only about 12% of the submissions. So the competition for publication is very high. As you can see, 88% of the manuscripts are rejected, so they have to go elsewhere. And then I'm going to go through a little bit about steps in peer review so that you know how peer review is done, so that you understand how to write a paper to give it its best chance for publication. Next slide. Okay, so in Cancer Research, as I'm the editor-in-chief, we also have an executive editor. So I would do the initial review of many of the papers, or half of the papers that comes into Cancer Research. So over 1,500 papers a year, I have to go through. And then my colleague also go through the other half. And what we do is the following, right? At first, every day I look at over 10 papers that comes through. So what do? You have to have a system to look at papers that are being submitted. So you look quickly and say, is the paper asking an important question? So the relevance. Is this manuscript reporting an important, timely finding relevant to the field? And if the answer is yes, then that's good, because it's really filling a gap, or potentially filling the gap of knowledge in that field. The other part is to ask whether it's technically sound. Are the methodologies right? Are they doing the right technique? Are the controls appropriate? Are the studies reproducible? Have they shown that they've replicated it? So really the question here is really whether it is technically sound, acceptable. Then finally, you gauge the novelty. Is this really a novel finding? Is this really giving us something new in the literature? Particularly, it provides a conceptual advance. It changes the way we think. And those are the best papers, is that with the manuscript, change the way we think, change the way we practice medicine, change the way we think about an area in science. Those are the really important papers that comes through. Next slide. So, as editor, as you can see, because we only accept 12% of manuscripts, we have to triage. We have to reject papers. So well over half of the papers within the first week are rejected. They don't go through a peer review process. And then the remaining papers are then assigned to senior editors. I show you a big picture of many people in the journal. They take a second look at the paper. These are experts in specific areas of cancer research. For example, we have pathologists on the editorial board. We have breast cancer experts. We have ovarian cancer experts. We have various experts in very specific field, colorectal cancer experts. So the paper goes to those experts who are senior editors. They look at the paper again for the same reason that I have looked at. And they, again, can reject the paper again. So then they reject less than half of the papers they look at. So you reject already many papers. And then the remaining papers then would go out for peer review. So this is where we assign referees or reviewers. And then as editor-in-chief, I oversee the entire process to make sure that we have quality control on how we gauge any disagreements among referees when the reports of the referee comes back. So next slide. So when we sign referees, the referees are experts in the field. They read the papers very carefully and they write up a critique of the paper. They read it very carefully. And usually we assign at least three experts in the field. We allow them about a month to provide a long report back, very carefully, key questions they have to answer. And generally, these experts in the field remain anonymous. We don't reveal their names. But now many journals are starting to allow for names of reviewers with their permission to be revealed in the publication itself. And one of those journals, eLife, which I was an editor on, is doing that now. If you read eLife, at the end of the paper, they'll tell you who the reviewers are. And then when all the critiques come back from 2 or 3 reviewers, as editor, we look at whether their comments are balanced, they're thoughtful, they're measured, they're helpful critiques. And then we also have to watch out for professional jealousy or people who are just, you know, they're tough. And so we want to look out for unnecessary viciousness or unhelpful comments that are vindictive. And then we, as editor, we have a right to just ignore those, right? And then we send a letter back to the authors and say, your paper's rejected because none of the reviewers like the paper. They have many, many bad critiques. Or we have good reviews. The papers, we said, provisionally, your paper can be accepted, but you have to revise it. You have to answer these questions. You may have to do more experiments. You may have to do a few more studies to get it published. Next slide. So from a referee perspective, so if I get the paper sent to me by a journal, that now I have to study very carefully. This is the level of most carefully, critically examining the paper. So as a referee, which I also serve, I look at the abstract, read the paper very carefully several times, look at the results, critically examine it, look at all the data very carefully to look for replication, and then look for controls, whether they're negative controls or positive controls. Look for proper statistical methods being used for analysis. And if I don't know the statistical methods, I consult a statistician and ask them, is this paper using the right statistical method? And then you look at the figures, looking for details, inconsistencies, look for improper image manipulation. This is important. Sometimes people manipulate images, and that's important to pick up. And then look at the conclusion, whether it's scholarly written, acknowledge what's been published in the field, show what's novel, and whether it's balanced or not. Next slide. And then I would write up the report and send it back to the journal. The editor would receive the referee reports. And again, I already mentioned that as editor, we assess biases by the reviewers. We look at the uniformity of recommendations. If they're all reject, that's easy. We reject the paper after reviewing the comments, or all accept a revision. Then we send it back and said, we can potentially accept your paper, but you need to revise it. And then the most important part of an editor is when you have some reviewers that says, this is a really good paper, and then one reviewer that says, I have a difficult time with this paper, that there's something wrong with it. And as editor, we have to just look very carefully in a balanced view and say, is this paper acceptable? And maybe ignore some of the very highly critical comments from one reviewer and bypass it to be able to intervene, if you will. So also, I want to let you know that it's very, very unusual these days that when you submit a manuscript that it's immediately accepted without revision. Always some sort of revision. And then we make a decision, we send a decision letter back to the authors. Reject, major revision, or minor revision. Usually minor revision means you just got to change your discussion, the text, or puts a few references in. Major revision usually requires additional studies, and that we provide more time for those papers to come back in for the revised manuscript. Next slide. So when you get a paper back, just because it's rejected, you actually should think about this. Many journals will allow you to appeal the decision, right? If you feel that the rejection was not completely fair, it is okay to get all your rebuttal responses back. But you have to do point by point, because the referee comments are going to be very detailed. So you take one point at a time, and point by point, you provide a response for why you think the rejection decision is wrong, and how you can answer and rewrite the paper to address all the critique from each referee. Now, there's no guarantee that the editor will say, okay, we're going to relook at your paper and perhaps we can reconsider it. But remember, when you do this, it may require significant amount of additional work, and there's no guarantee that it's going to ultimately be accepted. But it is an option to appeal the decision. Next slide. So anyways, I already went through this. The editor renders a decision. We send the letter out. Next slide. And I'm going to end up with some comments on responsible conduct of research. This is really important from an editor's perspective. We worry a lot about papers that are published that are either plagiarized, people stealing each other's work, publishing something that's copying from others' work without proper citation is called plagiarism, or generation of data that don't exist, right? Just making things up, it's called fabrication, or you manipulated the data in a way that's very inappropriate, it's called falsification. So in the United States, the National Institutes of Health, if you have funding, grant funding from the NIH, and you publish a paper and you have violated by exercising one of these, whether it's plagiarism, fabrication, or falsification, if it's proven to be true that you've done this, they will not allow you to get NIH funding for years. And you're not able to apply for NIH funding for at least 3 years until they release you from that hold. So this is serious. It's serious because it has implications for public trust. It has implications for loss of grant funding, and most importantly, it's loss of your reputation. So I think this is something I really want to point out. And in particular, for me, doing research is really a dialogue. You're having a discussion with nature by doing experiments. And you know, there's no reason to have a dialogue with nature if you're going to just lie about it. So this is important to be responsible for the conduct of research. Next slide. So very briefly, I just want to highlight here very quickly, without going into details, that many papers have been published in the past that are very high profile papers that claims really significant things. Some of the names are shown here, you can look them up. But these are papers that were uncovered later to be having one of those problems, fabricated, falsified, that try to open up a new field that really didn't exist. And the last paper by Dr. Patti, in fact, was clinical studies that may have harmed patients. And this is so important that you have to have responsible conduct of research. You don't end up harming people. And that's going to be critically important, at least for physicians who are doing research. Next slide. So finally, in the last slide, I just want to now emphasize why it's wonderful to get into the publication world. There's a joy of publishing. The joy for me is an intellectual adventure. It allows us to exercise our minds, to ask important questions, to be able to do scholarly work, to do research, to gather information, to really test out hypotheses to see if they're true or not. And then if that's not true, you move on to the next hypothesis. It is very stimulating to have this type of investigative life. It allows me to ask questions, to really probe nature, to see what nature is trying to tell us about what's going on what disease means and how do we fix diseases. And in doing so, I hope that we are advancing our knowledge. You know, every day we're learning something new that helps some things. And it really does contribute to society for the public good. And in the end, we're going to advance biomedicine. We will relieve the disease burden, whether that's cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, neurological disease, whatever you're working on, it's critically important. And that's why research and publication is such a joy for me. And so this is my last slide, and I thank you for your attention. So you can stop the slide now.
Wow, I think your presentation is has a lot of information and maybe advanced information that beginner researcher may find a little bit difficult. I'm still waiting for the question to come, and hopefully our supporting team will have all the questions available for me during the break. Meanwhile, we have a series of questions before the presentation that we have collected. Like, can I ask it to you now?
Yes, please.
Right. So, Professor, we have several good questions before the presentation. One guest asked that, what are some first impressions of the editors when they receive manuscripts of clinical research from Vietnam?
Yeah, so I really think, you know, for example, I'll just use Cancer Research as an example. It's an international journal. We get papers from all over the world, literally all continents. And it really, for me, the way what we look at it is not so much which country it comes from, but really you look at the content of the paper. Like I said, is it asking an important question? Is it filling a knowledge gap? Is the evidence strong? Is it reproduced? And so clinical papers, the same thing. You know, if you're doing clinical trials, it has to be rigorously done, right? The only thing I can say is that perhaps papers coming out internationally, you may write, for example, case reports, right? Case reports is not really a clinical trial. You make a clinical observation that's very unique, and you want to report it to the world. So, for example, if you have a unique syndrome in Vietnam, right? So you see some syndrome, whether it's a genetic disorder that is unique to Vietnam, that's reportable, and you have to collect enough clinical evidence to show that it is a unique syndrome, and that would be unique, and I think it will be well received coming from Vietnam. But if you're going to do a clinical trial, make sure that the clinical trial is asking an important question that advances the field. It shouldn't be a clinical study that is replicating what's known already, but only in the Vietnamese population, right? So, for example, I'm just going to make this up, but let's say you use an anti-diabetic drug that's already proven in Europe or US or other continents to work. And now you're applying to the Vietnamese population and you find the same results for the Vietnamese population. That is not novel, except if there are genetic alterations in the Vietnamese population that gives you a potential different outcome to giving that same drug, right? Then it would be novel. So novelty is going to be critical coming out of Vietnam.
Right. Well, this is very informative from your suggestion. They have another questions like, what are the two greatest challenges that you have ever confronted when you analyze and publicize your data in research?
Well, I think the biggest.
Sorry, there is another answer, and how can you address them? So, yeah. So this question is more likely to be like more strategic. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think that when you're considering writing a manuscript or telling a story, remember that the biggest challenges you're going to meet is, and it's unfortunate, this is the real world, right? We have so-called journals that are very highly cited and journals that are not that well cited, right? So-called in the lingo of publication, they call them high impact journals versus non-high impact journals. So if you're trying to compete for visibility of your work, right? You want to publish it in high impact journals. For example, in the clinical world, generally New England Journal of Medicine is a very high impact journal. Those journals tend to be highly critical, and the reviewers tend to be very overly critical. So the challenges are that you're gonna meet with a lot of criticisms going right into it. So be prepared if you're gonna submit your paper to high impact journals that you're in for the long run. You have to be persistent. You have to have staying power. Don't give up if you really think you have a good story. So that's going to be the biggest challenge. Now, you can take that same story and you send it to a non-high impact journal. You might be able to get it through a little bit faster. So the judgment that you need to have is the following. Is there an urgency to get your paper out? Is there a reason why you have to publish it quickly, right? If you have to publish it quickly, I would advise you to don't go to the non-high impact journal. Just get it out, right? But if you really want to get the attention of the world for something you believe is very important, you have to be patient. It takes a while to publish a paper. Nowadays, when you submit a paper, it takes over a year to get it published, by the way. Just let me make it clear. You submit a paper, it's over a year before the paper, on average, will get published. Why? Because of the peer review process, the revision that you have to do, it goes back in, it goes back out to peer review, comes back in, so that whole cycle actually can take well over a year to get a good paper published. So I would say be patient and just really just stick, stay with it if you really believe in it.
Well, I think our guest already fired very informative from your dedicated answer. And I think we may now have a few minute breaks for the professor to rest a little bit, and we may return in the next 10 minutes, I think. And we will have 45 minutes of question and answer, and our supporting team will prepare on the question for the professor now. Meanwhile, I have typed in the meeting chat that if our attendees have questions, please fill in the link, the tiny URL link that is for questions, and please do so so that we can summarize and put it forward for the professor. And meanwhile, we can I have the privilege to introduce how Johns Hopkins University and Pham University of Medicine have met in real people. How do we link together, and how to have this very prestigious webinar tonight? And may I introduce Assistant Professor Doãn Đào. He is from Johns Hopkins University, and he is the liaison between the US and our Vietnamese side. And he is formerly doctor from Vietnam, and I think I will give the speaking to him. As Professor Doãn Đào, we have the privilege to have you here, and can you share some of your remarks about the program and about this webinar tonight?
Yes,
the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Minh Nguyen. And once again, thank you, Professor G, for the really informative and wonderful lecture. I am Doãn Đào, serving as Director of the Center of Excellence for Liver Disease in Vietnam. This, by way of background, is a collaborative initiative between Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and 3 institutions in Ho Chi Minh City: Ho Chi Minh City Health Department, Pham Thach University, and MEDEC Medical Center Network. The mission of the center is to advance the science of liver disease in Vietnam through patient care, research, and education. So this webinar today is within our missions, and it is the first in a series of webinars that we, working together with our partners in Vietnam, are putting together. We hope that you all find this webinar useful, and I once again really appreciate our host institution today, Pham Thach University of Medicine. Go to the next slide, please. So next is, I thought that I would share with you some of my personal notes regarding Professor G. And it is really a true honor to be able to present him to you today. So Dr. G's scientific contributions, leadership, and influence in cancer research and patient care as a physician scientist are well-renowned and well-recognized, as evidenced by his memberships to the American National Academy of Arts and Sciences, and member of the National Academy of Medicine. As you may know, being elected to these societies to me is arguably the ultimate dream of those who do science and medicine. So people like Dr. G are considered rock stars in science. A few other personal notes. Professor G relocated to the US from Vietnam when he was 12 years old, and he has made several trips to Vietnam. The last one was just a few years ago. And he has always wanted to make contribution to Vietnam. So when we had the opportunity to invite him to present this lecture, he accepted right away without any reservation. So we are really grateful for that. And for your information, he speaks Vietnamese relatively well, as you already noticed when he began his presentation. So with that, I once again appreciate the host institution and all of your attendance, as well as Professor Chi's time and generosity presenting the lecture today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Doãn Đào. And may I have the attention to present our Associate Professor Pham Kim Hồng. She is head of our scientific research unit of Pham Ngoc University of Medicine, and we have honor to have her tonight, and it is please have madam.
Okay, thank you, Professor Chi, and also Associate Professor Doãn for being here today. And I would like to take this occasion to thank Professor Chi for taking your time and effort to share with us a very interesting topic, and also share your experience in publishing papers. It's really good lessons for us to the way to publish as many as possible papers in international journals. Actually, this is really interesting topic, and by this time we just want to show our appreciation to your time to present here, and I just try to take the chance to give you the gift. I hope you can see this. And I know that in the future, in very near future, maybe in January next year, right? You would be here. You could visit Ho Chi Minh City, and I hope that at that time we can give you this directly. Yeah, I think today is really interesting time for us to listen to you, and we look forward to listening to your next presentations, and listening to your experience, sharing with us your experience in publishing many papers in well-known journals in the future. Thank you.
We are now starting the question and answer and discussion part. So now we may have a few minutes break, and we can see you back at 8:10, and our presentation will return at 8:10 in 5 minutes, and our supporting team will loading up on the interesting questions. And please, to our attendees, please do not hesitate to have questions for us for this luckiest moment with the greatest professor in cancer research tonight. For those who have a smartphone, we have presenting a QR code on the lower left bottom of the screen. You can scan and get into the question forms directly from that QR code. So now 5 minutes break. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We are now starting the question and answer and discussion part. May I ask your returning, please? Right. We have summarized a few questions for Professor G tonight. There are about a dozen of interesting questions, and I will copy and paste the question in the comment chat, and I will ask it directly to Professor so that both all of our guests and our attendees can have a look. So before the break, Professor G also mentioned about the motivation, and right now there is two attendees asking the same things: how to keep the motivation to submit, to write the manuscript, and to submit for publication. How do we keep? So current question is, how do we keep the motivation for continuous writing and submitting for scientific publication? How can you keep the motivation in the long run? I think that's what I mean. May I have Professor to answer about this question, please?
Okay. So the question is, how do you keep motivation, right? So I think there are different ways of looking at this questions. So for example, if you are doing a clinical study and you're asking a critical question that really needs to be answered and you think you have the answer, then you have to be persistent. That's the word, persistent. So let me just use an example that could be realistic for Professor Duan, for example. So let's say that you do a study that looks at early markers of liver cancer. And of course, liver cancer is a major burden in Vietnam. And assuming that you have the right study design and you found a new marker for early liver cancer detection, and that would help intervene by imaging studies, for example, CT scans and other type of scans, ultrasound, and you can intervene or intercept early cancer very, at the point where you actually can cure it by surgery. I think that's a critical finding, that you have to be persistent, and you need to ask yourself, how many more cases do I need to have statistical significance if you don't think you have it yet? And once you think you have statistical power to report your findings, I would say you should be persistent. Stay with the journals, and also the other thing that I think could help is you reach out to people you know in the network, those people might know other people to help craft the paper in such a way, if you're going to, you know, pitch it to English journals, which most of them are these days, to write it in such a way that is most compelling, right? And the motivation is going to come from the fact that you found something important you want to tell. I think that's where the motivation comes in, but I think don't lose that motivation. If you get rejection, seek some help. Get people who've written a lot of papers to look at your paper. Make sure that it's written in a way that's compelling, tells a good story. You know, the narrative is very well constructed, and I think that's going to be critical and important to keep your motivation up. The motivation should always come from trying to help patients.
All right. Professor, we have another question about this point of view. So why some journals allow authors to recommend the reviewers, except from avoiding conflicting reviewers? And in case of not double-blind review, how can we avoid bias in reviewing? I think this question is a little bit skepticism, and I think their meaning is, how is there any discrimination when the editor sees the affiliation? I mean, the authors are from countries like Vietnam. Is there any like you know, any kind of well, I don't know how to say it, discrimination?
Yeah, I understand the question. So my advice would be the following. So basically, you can suggest reviewers. Usually, if you suggest reviewers, if they are authoritative, meaning as somebody that the journals will ask to review your paper, that the reviewers hopefully will know you or know some of your work, would help a lot. But, you know, of course, if you're just starting out, you won't have that level of recognition, right? So that's difficult. So I think you can recommend reviewers as long as you know that if you go into international journals, find internationally known people who could review it fairly. That's important, because the fair reviewers will, if they favor your paper, it gives your paper a better chance to be accepted. I don't think there's inherent discrimination when you look at affiliation from third world countries. I think the thing that at least I look for, and most editors will look for, is the novelty and the impact of the paper, right? If it has something that's impactful, then it's going to be something that they want to publish. And when I use the word novelty, what I mean is that it's providing a new fundamental glimpse of new knowledge from the study. That's going to be critically important. So I would say discrimination, I don't think so. Although, you know, the level of the type of science, whether it's clinical science, population science, or basic science, have to be, you know, on par with the rest of the world, right? And I would not count it as discrimination automatically because you see names or institutions from third world countries. There could be implicit bias, and I'll just say what that means, right? So we all have implicit bias. We're built to react to things quickly until we think about it. So there may be some implicit biases when papers comes into US journals from third world countries. But I think that's why, at least as editor for cancer research, I choose the best senior editors that I know who can be fair. That's the most important part.
Professor, may I interrupt you for the last part of your answer? So the point is to find some editors who appears to be fair, but that sounds like a little bit outstanding task for us in countries like Vietnam, because for the developed country, for the high income countries, there are a networking of scholars, and there are like reputation, and that can be like, you know, circular around. But for researcher from middle income countries or low income countries, we know nothing about who appear to be fair. And you know, on my point of view, like I have a very hard time publishing my study research as well. So, and from my experience, some journal just have this similar comment like, you need to double check your English because you are not native English speakers. And I found that very weird because my professor is from Australia. He already double checked all of it, and I still got this comment. And usually these kinds of comments are from the paper which will reject the manuscript in the very near future. After that, after we have a response letter to the reviewers. And I think that is the viewpoint that we have here, a little bit in confidence about ourselves. Do you have any way to address this?
Yeah, so I think that's a difficult situation that you described, because to me, I haven't seen the paper or look at the manuscript, but I think that the inherent bias, if somebody who's a co-author from Australia had looked at it and, you know, look at the narrative and stuff like this, that, you know, everything looks fine, that comment, I would argue, I mean, let's say that paper came through Cancer Research and I disagree with the editor who's handling it, I will override it, right? I would just double check on it. So this is where I think the appeal system, I think, would be very helpful. For example, for that paper particularly, it could be that your co-author and you, the co-author from Australia, write a letter from Australia and said, look, we don't understand what this comment means. It seems like some inherent bias that is blocking the journal from looking at the paper for the substance of what it's trying to report, right? So you can appeal it and point it out to the editor that you've made a mistake. If you really believe it's truly a mistake, I point it out. And I wouldn't just give up, you know, I would not give up because that this was discriminated against, and you'll know. Yeah.
Right. I understand it. Right. Thank you, sir. May I have another question from? I think this question is quite interesting as well. So the next question is how to discuss a paper, a result, a manuscript result in an appealing way. What kind of citation should we consider to include or exclude in our discussion? This is from a very young participant, I think. And he or she may in the early career research. So the question is how to discuss in an appealing way, and what kind of citation should we consider?
Okay, so there's a general rule of thumb. Okay, so let's say if you're familiar with a field, one of the best things to understand a field is to read a lot of papers about that field, right? But that's the one thing, whenever I train trainees, I said, look, one of the best way to really command your own publication is to command the field by reading the papers, many papers, hundreds of papers, understand the field, right? So that's number one, that you need to understand the field very clearly on who's leading the field, right? In the area, what are the current biases in the field? Because every field has a bias. There's a body of knowledge that's been biased, right? And then we correct it along the way. That's what science does. So one way to make it appealing would be acknowledge what is the current thinking in the field. Make sure And there's a little bit of something I would call the politics of science, right? Make sure that if you want to change the thinking, do it in scholarly, diplomatic way, right? There's no reason to write a discussion that's going to anger someone, although you can't control that. So I would say the way that I would cite papers for citation would be make sure you cite some of the key thought leaders in the field, right? The thought leaders in the field. You should recognize who they are if you're writing a paper about a certain subject. That's where you command the literature. You read the papers. So make sure you cite the key papers and say that this is what's known, but, you know, we have found something interesting that advanced our knowledge, and it may not fit with the last series body of thinking. It changes it, and this is the evidence I have. Now, of course, if you try to publish something that's very different, I guarantee you that's going to be a hard ride. Even I'm in the United States for many years. The first paper that we published that tried to shift the field from studying cancer genes, oncogenes, to metabolism, which is what we discovered over 20 years ago when I was at Johns Hopkins, I had a very hard time publishing that because it is upsetting the field. The field doesn't want to believe it, right? And no matter what, who you cite, people are not going to accept change very quickly. And so that's a very different situation where you have to be persistent. You just got to be persistent. Get it into a journal. So in this case, I would say make sure don't ignore the thought leaders in your field, because if the paper ends up in their hands, you want to make sure you cite them, right? Because we're all kind of introspective and maybe to some extent selfish, is that you look at a paper, if you're an expert, somebody's writing a paper in that field and they don't even mention some of your key work. That's not a good thing if that happens to be the reviewer of your paper, okay? So, all right.
So your suggestion is do a very good literature review before any trying to submit a manuscript in that field. Just do a thorough literature review. Yeah. Can we move to another point of view? So the next question is about, as an editor, how do you manage a negative comments or opinions from reviewers that seem to have a conflict of interest with the research group or the research author? So as an editor, how can you manage negative comment towards the reviewers?
Yeah, so that, to me, that's actually relatively simple, because basically as an editor, like I said in my presentation, when I get conflicting reviews, right? So let's say you send to 3 reviewers, you have 2 very good reviews, favorable to the paper. You have a 3rd review who's very tough on the paper. That's where the hard work comes in. When you read the 3rd review, make sure that they are scientifically sound comments, not biased comments, but scientifically sound comments. So what do I mean by that? That's where your own expertise comes in. So if it's in the immediate area of my field, or even outside of my field, I tend to have relatively significant, broad enough cancer knowledge that I can determine whether this 3rd reviewer is truly biased. I mean, truly biased, and I've seen this. If it's truly biased, I ignore that reviewer as an editor. Basically, I don't even send the paper back to the person if it gets revised. I eliminate them from the reviewing pool. So that's how I handle it. So we know true bias when we see it, and that's why good journals can really handle that.
All right, sir. Wow. We have another. I think we may have a few minutes for some interesting questions only. So I may select 3 more questions for you, and we're now moving to a little bit backward to how would you give some advice for how the researcher, especially young researcher, to find scholarship or to do PhD degree in the US environment. So the question is there any advice, and especially from your point of view, about how to find PhD scholarship or research scholarship for outsider, for people from lower income countries?
Yeah, so this is a bit difficult because, for example, the Fogarty Center at NIH try to have programs to bring people in from other countries, right? But the programs are very small. So the type of funding for visiting researchers are very limited. So that's truly a real problem. And I'm hoping that with some influence I have with various groups in Vietnam, I hate to say it, but including the VIN group that you probably know, that I hope there will be scholarships that are going to be available to have people allowed to go to other countries to get additional training. I think that's really your question. I think short of that, I can imagine that, you know, maybe through Johns Hopkins we can begin, and I can work with Yuan about how to, for example, create a network of Vietnamese American scientists and physicians as a network where young researchers in Vietnam can virtually connect with people in the United States as potential kind of side mentors, right? Mentors to guide some of the people. And I think that's something we can think about organizing that could help, short of going to other countries to get training, because you can be advised to take certain steps that would be useful without, you know, that is, in the absence of the advice, you wouldn't know what to do. So I think that's something that, you know, we can imagine and trying to create a network of virtual mentors, if you will. And I think we have a lot of Vietnamese physician scientists here in the United States and Europe. You know, maybe there could be a ground up, you know, bottom up kind of creation of such a network now that, you know, the kind of media we have to connect with each other is quite versatile, like this particular meeting here. That's something that we can think about.
Right, sir. So we have a second to last question. This question is quite general. What are the most important parts of the scientific manuscript in your consideration?
I think probably for me, for cancer research, we're looking for what we call high impact papers. And when you look at high impact papers, usually the two elements, right? One, is it novel? Is it telling something really interesting and new? So if you imagine, the way I kind of look at this is this, right? If you imagine in international skating, like Olympics, usually they give two scores, right? They have a artistic score for the artistry of the skating. Then they have the technical score, right? So science, very similar. For me, the artistic score is the creativity, the novelty. And then the technical score is how well technically the study was done. So if it's a clinical study, how well the statistics is done, how well it's designed, and then the artistic score would be, is that a creative question to ask that answers something different? So I think those are the two key elements: is high artistic score, high technical score.
Right. And I think we are already a little bit past our our scheduled times, but there is another interesting, and I think it's quite interesting here, is one attendee asked us about how to refrain from gift authorship, since in many cases some unrelated authors are added in the last step submission to the PI. I will take it down here. So yep. So
yeah, so
how do you react?
Yeah. So I would say that this is an important issue, that some of it is cultural. I know certain countries will do this. I would say that it should be institutionally driven as a culture, that doing this is actually not great for the manuscript. Remember that when I showed you the list of authorships and what's required, like which authors are doing what, make sure that's legitimate, right? So to just put a person authors on is, without doing anything, is not sufficient. At least the person should participate in reviewing the manuscript and editing it, right? Doing something for the manuscript, but just plain gift authorships is not really acceptable. And I wouldn't condone that practice whatsoever. I know that sometimes people have added authorships, for example, since you asked about third world countries, people, particularly I've seen papers from China where people would add authorships of names from the United States, right, to really add to it. And that's something that, as long as in the authorship justification contribution is stated very clearly that that person had contributed this, then we're okay.
Wow, okay. Yeah. So it's a little bit hard, I think, so this final point of view. Actually, we have running out of time, and we are really happy to have your share thoughts and your advanced slides as well. I think the level of tonight is very advanced and not easy for a beginner researcher to absorb quickly. And may I ask you to have some summary for finalize the webinar tonight, please?
Yeah, so just very briefly, thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope this is informative. So basically, the only way I could summarize this is that a researcher's life, if you are lucky, as I feel like I am, it's a wonderful journey, and the joy of publication is there, and persistence is critically important to publication. If you're not persistent, this is not the road you want to take, right? It takes work. You have to know how to deal with rejection, because that's a part of the life. You get more rejections than you get acceptance. That's okay, but it's a long road. I always say that research is a marathon. A marathon, you run 20, many kilometers, right? It's not a dash. It's not a 100-yard dash or a 100-meter dash, right? It's a long trip. You stay with it, and that's my last comment.
Yeah, actually, I feel very happy to listen to you and to be the MC of tonight's webinar. I got more rejected than accepted for manuscript submission, and for a while I feel like I'm very down and very upset. But you are a live a live teacher, a live researcher that share your thoughts with younger generations, and I feel very happy to have listening to it right now. May I ask if Professor Doãn Đào has any further comments for our webinar tonight, please?
Good evening, everyone in Vietnam and elsewhere. Thank you again for this informative webinar from Professor G and the host institution, Pham Ngoc Thach. No the comment except to agree with Professor G that you got to be persistent in doing research and publishing in scientific journal. Thank you.
Oh, all right. So we also, so finally we have come to a conclusion for our webinar. To our dearest attendees, we will send you the materials and including the recording material in the next few days after we merge on the question and answer part and with the main parts of the presentation, and we will send it to all of the attendees emails. And I think we have although we have some technical problem at the beginning, I think we can conclude the webinar quite successfully. And we thank to the last 139 attendees who stay with us until the last minutes. And it is our great honor to have you here tonight. And we will organize surely a few more webinars, and please look forward to our presentation in the future. Thank you very much. You are very, very well dedicated people. Thank you, and thank you. Have a good night.